Jake Miller had been working salvage runs for almost 5 years now, and he'd learned one important rule: abandoned stations always had a story. Sometimes it was a good story, the kind that ended with valuable tech and a fat paycheck. Other times, well, those were the stories he tried to forget. The distress beacon from Research Station Outpost 7 had been pinging across the sector for 3 weeks. Most salvagers ignored it. Too far out, they said. Not worth the fuel. But Jake had a hunch, and his hunches usually paid off. The station orbited a dead planet in the outer rim, far from any trade routes or colonies. Whatever happened here, nobody had stuck around to see it through. His ship, the Lone Wanderer, wasn't much to look at. She was old, patched together with spare parts and hope, but she'd never let him down. As the docking clamps locked onto the station's port, Jake grabbed his toolkit and flashlight. The air felt heavy, wrong somehow, as the airlock hissed open. Inside, the station was completely dark. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing the chaos left behind. Equipment was scattered everywhere, screens cracked and sparking, and there were scorch marks on the walls. Jake moved carefully through the corridors, his boots crunching on broken glass. Whatever happened here, people had left in a hurry. He'd been searching for almost an hour when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the station's failing systems, some pipe rattling or air recycler dying. But then he heard it again. A soft chirping sound, almost like a bird, but sadder somehow. Scare. Jake followed the sound to the laboratory section. The door was half open, jammed that way by a fallen storage crate. He squeezed through and immediately felt the cold. This room was freezing, much colder than the rest of the station. His flashlight found them huddled in the corner, inside a large containment unit that glowed faintly with emergency power. 3 small creatures pressed together for warmth, their scales catching the light in shimmering patterns of red, white, and black. They were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Draconi. He'd never seen one in person, but everyone in the galaxy knew about them. Dragon-like predators who ruled entire star systems. Their warriors were legendary, their ships unstoppable. Most species gave them a wide berth and hoped to never cross paths. And here were 3 babies, trembling in the cold, staring at him with eyes too large for their small faces. The temperature gauge on the containment unit blinked angry red numbers at him. The power cell was dying. Maybe 45 minutes left, maybe less. After that, the temperature in this room would drop below freezing. These creatures wouldn't survive that. Jake's hands moved on instinct, pulling up the station's computer logs on a nearby terminal that still had power. The files loaded slowly, corrupted and fragmented, but he got the picture. Smuggling operation. Someone had raided a Draconi nest, killed the adult dragons and stolen the eggs. They'd brought them here to this remote station to hatch them, probably planning to sell them on the black market. But something had gone wrong. The logs showed an incoming security patrol, and the smugglers had panicked. They'd grabbed what they could and run, leaving everything else behind, including 3 newly hatched Draconi with no one to care for them. Jake looked back at the hatchlings. They were watching him, their bodies shaking from cold and fear. The red one, slightly larger than the others, took a tiny step forward and made a sound that broke Jake's heart. It was a whimper, a plea for help. Every logical part of Jake's brain was screaming at him to walk away. Taking these creatures was dangerous. The Draconi would hunt him down. Other smugglers would want them. He'd be painting a target on his back that would never go away. But Jake had never been good at listening to the logical part of his brain. He moved slowly toward the containment unit, not wanting to scare them more than they already were. His fingers found the release mechanism and carefully opened the door. The hatchlings flinched backward, pressing against the far wall. They were afraid of him, but they had nowhere to run. Jake knelt down and extended his hand, palm up, the way you might approach a scared dog. He kept his movements gentle and slow. The red hatchling watched him for a long moment, then cautiously moved forward. Its scales were ice cold when it brushed against his fingers. That seemed to break something in the other 2. They rushed forward, all 3 of them trying to get close to his warmth at once. Jake carefully scooped them into his arms, feeling how light they were, how fragile. Their bodies shook against his chest as he stood up. They made small chirping sounds, almost like purring, as they absorbed his body heat. Jake looked down at them and sighed. His life had just gotten incredibly complicated, but there was no way he could leave them here to die alone in the dark. He wrapped them in his jacket and started back toward his ship. They nestled against him, their trembling slowly stopping as they warmed up. The red one kept looking up at his face, those large golden eyes seeming to study him. As Jake secured them in a makeshift nest in his ship's cargo hold and set course away from the station, He had no idea that he'd just made a choice that would change not just his life, but the entire galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be human. 2 weeks had passed since Jake rescued the hatchlings, and his life had become absolute chaos. The lone wanderer, once his quiet sanctuary among the stars, now looked like a tornado had torn through it. Deep scratch marks covered the metal walls where tiny claws had scraped during playtime. His carefully organized tool cabinet had been knocked over at least 6 times. And his food supplies, which should have lasted 3 months, were now down to maybe 2 weeks if he was lucky. The hatchlings had grown fast, alarmingly fast. When he'd first found them, they were barely the size of house cats. Now, just 14 days later, they were closer to the size of medium dogs, and they showed no signs of slowing down. Jake was starting to worry about how big they'd eventually get and whether his ship could handle it. He'd named them on the 3rd day, mostly because saying "hey you" to 3 creatures who followed him everywhere was getting confusing. Blaze for the red one with scales that seemed to glow like hot coals. Ice for the white one whose scales sparkled like fresh snow. And Midnight for the black one with scales so dark they seemed to absorb light. They were inseparable from him now. Wherever Jake went, 3 pairs of footsteps followed. When he worked on the ship's engine, they crowded around to watch. When he ate, they sat at his feet, chirping hopefully for scraps. When he slept, they curled up on his bunk, taking up more space each night as they grew. Jake tried everything to get some personal space. He'd close the door to the cockpit, and they'd scratch at it until he opened it again. He'd tell them to stay in the cargo hold, and they'd howl like he'd abandoned them forever. Once, he'd made the mistake of locking them in for 5 minutes while he took a shower. When he came out, Blaze had melted part of the door handle with a burst of frustrated fire. This morning was typical. Jake was trying to check their navigation system when Blaze decided his leg was the perfect thing to wrap around. The hatchling coiled around his calf, making it impossible to reach the control panel properly. "You guys know I'm not your mom, right?" Jake said, trying to gently untangle himself. "I'm just the guy who picked you up. Your real family is out there somewhere." Blaze chirped at him and squeezed tighter. Ice and Midnight were wrestling near the captain's chair, tumbling over each other in a mess of scales and wings. That was the thing Jake was slowly coming to understand. They'd imprinted on him, bonded in some way he didn't fully grasp. Every book and database entry he'd read about Draconi mentioned this imprinting behavior. Hatchlings bonded with the first being they trusted, usually their mother. Once bonded, they refused to leave that being's side. Jake had been spending his free time searching for Draconi settlements or colonies, anywhere he could safely return the hatchlings. But every time he mentioned it, every time he packed a bag or moved toward the airlock like he was going somewhere without them, all 3 would panic. They'd screech, their voices getting louder and more distressed. Small puffs of fire would shoot from Blaze's mouth. Ice would create these little frost clouds around her feet. And Midnight would position himself between Jake and the door, refusing to move. It was becoming clear that returning them wasn't going to be as simple as Jake had hoped. The real trouble started when they stopped at a refueling station in the Gamma sector. Jake needed supplies badly, and this station was one of the few that didn't ask too many questions. He should have known better. Places that don't ask questions usually have people who shouldn't be asking them. Jake was at the trading post, haggling with a grumpy station master over the price of protein packs, when he noticed them. 3 aliens standing near the docking bay entrance, trying too hard to look casual. They were big, heavily armed, and their eyes kept drifting to Jake. More specifically, to the 3 hatchlings who'd insisted on following him to the station despite his protests. Bounty hunters. Jake's stomach dropped. He'd heard the rumors on the communication channels. Word had spread fast about a human traveling with Draconi young. Some people thought he'd stolen them. Others thought he was selling them. Either way, the hatchlings were worth a fortune on the black market, and there were plenty of beings willing to take that fortune by force. Jake tried to finish his transaction quickly, keeping one eye on the hunters. He paid for his supplies and started back toward his ship, the hatchlings trotting beside him. Maybe if he moved fast enough they wouldn't try anything in public. He was wrong. They made their move in the docking bay, away from the main crowds. The lead hunter, a massive creature with gray skin and too many arms, stepped into Jake's path. His partners fanned out to block the exits. "Hand over the lizards, human, and you can walk away," the hunter said, his voice like gravel grinding together. He raised a weapon, some kind of energy rifle that hummed with power. "This doesn't have to get messy." Jake's mind raced. He wasn't a fighter, never had been. He was a salvager, someone who avoided trouble, not someone who faced it head-on. His hand moved toward the small pistol on his belt, but he knew it was useless against 3 armed hunters. Before he could even draw it, the hatchlings moved. It happened so fast that Jake barely processed it. Despite being only knee-high, they launched themselves at the hunters with speed and coordination that seemed impossible for creatures so young. Blaze went straight for the leader, opening his mouth and releasing a stream of fire that was much larger than the small puffs Jake had seen before. The hunter screamed and stumbled backward, beating at the flames on his jacket. Ice created a blinding flash of frost and cold that filled the air like a fog bomb, making it impossible to see. And Midnight, the smallest and quietest of the three, darted through the confusion like a shadow. Jake watched in amazement as the black hatchling moved between the hunter's legs, tripping one and then another with perfect timing. The whole fight lasted maybe 30 seconds. The hunters, trained professionals who'd probably taken down targets 10 times their size, scrambled away from 3 baby dragons who barely reached their knees. They fled back into the station, shouting and cursing. The hatchlings rushed back to Jake immediately, rubbing against his legs and making proud chirping sounds. They looked up at him with those big eyes, clearly expecting praise for protecting him. Jake stood there, his supplies scattered on the ground, trying to catch his breath. His hands were shaking from adrenaline. "Okay," he said slowly, kneeling down to their level. They pressed against him, seeking comfort after the fight. "Maybe you can stay a little longer." But deep down, as he felt their warmth against him and heard their contented chirps, Jake knew it wasn't his choice anymore. These 3 creatures had chosen him as their guardian, their protector, their family. And somehow, without meaning to, he'd chosen them too. Jake had sent the distress signal 3 days ago, hoping for help, maybe some guidance on where to take the hatchlings. When the massive Draconai warship Crimson Talon appeared on his sensors, he'd actually felt relief wash over him. Finally, he thought, someone who could help these kids get home. That relief had evaporated the moment he docked with the warship. The Crimson Talon wasn't just big, it was enormous. Jake's entire ship could fit inside one of its cargo bays with room to spare. As he walked through its corridors, escorted by silent warriors who towered over him, he realized just how small and fragile humans really were compared to the Draconai. These beings were built like living weapons, all muscle and scales and barely contained power. Now he stood in their command chamber, and terror had replaced that earlier relief. The room was massive, with high ceilings that made him feel even smaller. Draconai warriors lined the walls, at least 20 of them, all watching him with unreadable expressions. Their scales gleamed in shades of red, gold, and bronze under the harsh lighting. Commander Rachel Blackscale stood before him, and she was the most intimidating being Jake had ever seen. She was easily 9 feet tall, her crimson scales polished to a mirror shine. She'd taken a human name during some diplomatic service years ago, something Jake had read about in a news report once. It was supposed to be a gesture of friendship between species, a sign of respect for humanity. Right now, though, she didn't look very friendly. "You dare claim guardianship over royal bloodline hatchlings?" Her voice echoed through the chamber, each word sharp as broken glass. Jake's mouth was dry, but he forced himself to speak. "I'm not claiming anything. I'm trying to return them. That's why I called you. They were abandoned on a research station, dying in the cold. I saved them because nobody else was there to do it." Rachel's tail, thick as a tree trunk, swept across the floor with a sound like thunder. "So you say? Do you have any idea what you've done, human? Do you understand what these hatchlings represent?" "I know they're Draconai," Jake said, confusion mixing with his fear. "I know they needed help. They are heirs to the Fireborn clan, one of the oldest and most powerful families in our empire." Rachel moved closer, and Jake had to tilt his head back to keep eye contact. "Their parents were Lord Ember and Lady Crimson, 2 of our finest warriors. Their deaths were no accident. It was assassination, a political murder designed to end their bloodline. And now, somehow, a human salvager has bonded with the last surviving members of that bloodline." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Royal bloodline? Assassination? This was so much bigger than he'd imagined. He'd thought they were just regular hatchlings, orphans who needed a ride home. Behind him, Blaze, Ice, and Midnight huddled closer to his legs. They'd been nervous since boarding the warship, staying pressed against Jake like he was the only safe thing in a dangerous world. Now, surrounded by their own kind, they seemed even more frightened. Low growls rumbled in their throats as they watched the adult Draconai warriors. Rachel noticed their behavior. Her eyes narrowed. "Interesting. They fear their own kind but trust you." She gestured with one clawed hand. "Bring the hatchlings here. It's time they learned proper Draconai ways." 2 warriors stepped forward, massive beings who made Jake feel like a child. They reached toward the hatchlings with careful but firm movements. Everything happened at once. Blaze unleashed a torrent of flames that was far larger than anything Jake had seen from him before. Real fire, hot enough that Jake felt the heat wash over him. Ice screeched, a sound so high-pitched and distressed that Jake's ears rang. And Midnight positioned himself directly between Jake and the approaching warriors, his small body rigid with determination despite being a fraction of their size. No. Stop. Jake dropped to his knees without thinking, his arms going around all three hatchlings. He pulled them close, feeling their hearts racing against his chest. They burrowed into him, trembling, making frightened chirping sounds that broke his heart. It's okay, I've got you. Rachel raised her hand sharply, and the warriors stepped back immediately. The command chamber fell silent except for the hatchling's distressed whimpering. Rachel stared at the scene before her, and Jake couldn't read her expression. Was it anger? Surprise? Disgust that a human dared to interfere? Finally she spoke, and her voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. The imprint bond. They fully bonded with you. I had hoped the reports were exaggerated, but I see now they were accurate. What does that mean? Jake asked, still holding the trembling hatchlings. It means they see you as their parent, their protector, the center of their world. Draconite hatchlings formed this bond only once in their lifetime. Rachel's tail moved in a pattern Jake didn't understand. To separate them from you now, after the bond has formed so deeply, would break their minds. They would never recover. They would be. She paused, searching for words, empty shells. Alive but not truly living. Jake looked down at the three pairs of eyes staring up at him with complete trust. Blaze's golden eyes, Ice's blue ones, and Midnight's deep purple gaze. They were counting on him to keep them safe. Then what do we do? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's expression hardened. You prove you're worthy of them. Our laws are ancient and clear on this matter. If you can survive the Guardian trials, if you can prove yourself capable of protecting and raising royal hatchlings, then the bond will be honored. You will be recognized as their guardian under Draconite law. And if I fail? Jake already knew the answer, but he had to hear it. If you fail, you die. The trials are not designed for humans. They are designed to test Draconite warriors at their peak. Rachel's voice held no sympathy. And we will raise the hatchlings ourselves, doing our best to repair the damage from losing their bonded guardian. They will be broken, but perhaps we can salvage enough of their minds to train them for their duties. The hatchlings pressed even closer to Jake as if they understood what was being discussed. Maybe they did. They were smarter than Jake had given them credit for. He thought about his options. He could refuse, walk away, try to run. But the hatchlings would be devastated. He'd seen how they panicked when he was just in another room. What would losing him completely do to them? He thought about the trials designed for beings twice his size and strength. The odds of surviving were probably terrible. But when he looked down at Blaze, Ice, and Midnight, trusting him so completely, he knew there was really only one choice. Jake met Rachel's eyes. When do we start? The training grounds looked like something designed in a nightmare. Jake stood at the entrance on the first morning, staring at the massive facility that stretched out before him, and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The space was huge, filled with obstacles and challenges that seemed impossible. And every single one of them was built for warriors 3 times his size. The first challenge was the gravity well. Jake stepped into the chamber and immediately felt like someone had dropped a truck on his shoulders. The artificial gravity was set to 3 times normal, designed to test a Draconite warrior's strength and endurance. For Jake, it felt like his bones were trying to collapse in on themselves. He dropped to his hands and knees, gasping for air. The Draconite observers in the control room probably expected him to quit right there. But Jake noticed something they hadn't considered. The ceiling in this chamber was lower than in the rest of the facility, built at a height comfortable for someone his size, not theirs. And there were support beams running across it that a larger warrior wouldn't be able to reach or use effectively. Jake forced himself up and jumped, grabbing one of the beams. Using his smaller size and lighter weight, he pulled himself along the ceiling supports, hand over hand, avoiding the worst of the gravity pressure below. It took him twice as long as it should have, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he made it to the other side. The hatchlings, who were allowed to follow him through the trials, chirped excitedly when he collapsed on the safe platform. They'd learned to navigate the gravity well by flying short bursts, their wings still too small for real flight but enough to help them hop across. Day 2 brought environmental extremes. Rooms that shifted from burning hot to freezing cold within seconds. Jake's human body wasn't built for this kind of punishment. Draconite had thick scales that protected them from temperature changes. Jake just had skin and determination. But he watched the patterns, timed the shifts, and found the rhythm. He moved during the moderate moments and took shelter behind thermal barriers during the extremes. It wasn't about enduring the punishment like a Drakenei would. It was about being smart enough to avoid it. The combat drones on day 3 were the worst so far. They came at him with stunning speed, energy weapons blazing. Jake dove behind cover, his heart hammering in his chest. These things were designed to fight trained warriors, and he was just a salvager who'd never been in real combat before the bounty hunters at the refueling station. But Jake did what humans do best. He watched, he learned, he adapted. The drones had patterns in their programming, weaknesses in their decision trees. They attacked in predictable sequences, and they couldn't adjust well when something unexpected happened. Jake started using the environment against them, luring them into traps, shorting them out with exposed wiring, or just staying out of their firing solutions until their power cells depleted. Through it all, the hatchlings were with him. They were growing fast, adding mass and strength every day. By the 4th day they were the size of large wolves, their movements becoming more coordinated and powerful. And they were learning from Jake in ways that surprised everyone watching. Blaze stopped just breathing fire randomly when startled or excited. He started watching Jake for signals, waiting for the hand gesture or verbal command before unleashing his flames. Ice learned to create defensive barriers of frost on command, protecting Jake when the combat drones got too close. And Midnight, the quietest and most observant of the 3, developed Jake's cautious approach to danger. He started scouting ahead, warning Jake of threats before they became problems. Rachel watched from the observation deck above the training grounds, her expression unreadable behind the armored glass. Jake could feel her eyes on him during every challenge, judging, measuring, deciding if this human was worthy or just lucky. By day 6, Jake was exhausted. Every muscle in his body ached. He had bruises on his bruises, and he was pretty sure he'd cracked at least one rib during the obstacle course that morning. But he was still moving, still fighting, still refusing to quit. The hatchlings seemed to draw strength from his determination, pushing themselves harder because he wouldn't give up. Day 7 started like the others. Jake entered a maze challenge, the hatchlings close behind him. The goal was simple: navigate to the center and retrieve a marker. He'd dealt with mazes before, mapping them mentally as he went, leaving small marks to track his path. He was halfway to the center when the walls exploded inward. The blast threw Jake off his feet. His ears rang from the concussion and dust filled the air. Through the chaos he saw figures moving, real beings, not training drones. They were heavily armed, their weapons charged and ready. Assassins. Real ones. Sent to finish what they'd started months ago when they'd killed the hatchlings' parents. "Get behind me!" Jake yelled, scrambling to his feet and putting himself between the hatchlings and the attackers. But Blaze, Ice, and Midnight didn't listen. They'd grown confident through the trials, trusting their abilities and their bond with Jake. They'd also grown much larger, now the size of full wolves with developing wings and sharper claws. Energy bolts filled the air, red streaks of deadly light that scorched the maze walls. Jake grabbed a piece of debris from the exploded wall and used it as cover, his mind racing through options. He couldn't overpower these attackers. They were trained killers with superior weapons and armor. But he could outsmart them. Blaze left corridor. Jake shouted, pointing. "I seal the right. Midnight with me." The hatchlings moved as one unit, responding to his commands instantly. Blaze rushed left, unleashing a wall of flames that forced several assassins to retreat into a dead end. Ice created a barrier of frost that sealed off the right corridor, trapping more attackers. And Midnight stayed with Jake, his dark scales making him almost invisible in the smoke and dust. Jake used every dirty trick he knew. He led assassins into choke points where they couldn't use their numbers advantage. He collapsed weakened walls on them using Blaze's fire to melt support beams. He used Midnight as a scout, getting advance warning of ambushes. And he kept moving, never staying in one place long enough for them to pin him down. This wasn't the Drakenei way of fighting, standing strong and meeting force with force. This was human guerrilla tactics, the kind that smaller forces had used throughout Earth's history to fight against superior opponents. Use the terrain, stay mobile, hit them where they're weak, and never fight fair. When the last assassin fell, stunned by a coordinated attack from all 3 hatchlings, Jake collapsed against the maze wall. His shoulder burned, and when he looked down he saw blood soaking through his shirt. One of the energy bolts had grazed him, leaving a nasty burn. The hatchlings surrounded him immediately, their worried chirps filling the air. They pressed against him, careful of his wound, their eyes wide with concern. Rachel entered the maze, stepping over unconscious assassins and scorched debris. She surveyed the carnage with an experienced warrior's eye, taking in the tactical decisions Jake had made, the way he'd used the environment and the hatchlings' abilities together. "You didn't fight like a Draconai warrior," she said finally. Jake looked up at her, too tired and hurt to care about diplomacy. "No. I fought like a human. And I fought like their guardian, using every advantage I had to keep them safe." For the first time since Jake had met her, Rachel smiled. It transformed her face, making her look less like a terrifying warrior and more like someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. Perhaps that's exactly what they need. The ceremony took place in the Grand Hall of the Crimson Talon, a massive chamber with walls decorated in ancient Draconai symbols. Hundreds of warriors filled the space, their scales creating a rainbow of colors under the bright lights. Jake stood in the center, still wearing his torn and blood-stained clothes from the trials. He hadn't had time to change and honestly he was too exhausted to care. Rachel stood before him, holding an ornate piece of armor, a chest plate made from scales that shimmered like liquid metal. It was ancient, she'd explained, worn by guardians throughout Draconai history. Never before had it been placed on someone who wasn't Draconai. By the old laws and the sacred bond, Rachel's voice carried through the hall, "I name Jake Miller as guardian to the heirs of the Fireborn clan. First of his kind, honored among our people." She placed the armor on his chest, and Jake felt its weight settle on his shoulders. It was lighter than it looked but carried a significance he was only beginning to understand. The assembled warriors struck their tails against the floor in unison, a thunderous sound that echoed like drums. Blaze, Ice, and Midnight sat beside Jake throughout the ceremony, their heads held high. They'd grown so much in the past weeks. They were no longer the tiny, frightened creatures he'd found in that cold research station. They were strong, confident, and proud. But they still stayed close to him, still needed him, and that hadn't changed at all. After the ceremony ended, Jake walked back to the docking bay where the lone wanderer waited. Except it wasn't quite the same ship anymore. The Draconai had upgraded it while Jake was going through the trials. Reinforced hull plating covered the old patches and weak spots. Advanced shield generators hummed with power. The weapon systems had been enhanced, and the life support could now handle much larger passengers. His beat-up salvage ship had been transformed into something that could actually protect its crew. Rachel found him there, running his hand along the new armor plating. The three hatchlings were exploring the upgrades, chirping excitedly as they discovered improvements to their sleeping area and new training spaces. "You could stay," Rachel said, her voice softer than Jake had heard before. "Raise them here among our people. You've earned that right. The royal family would give you land, resources, anything you needed. The hatchlings would learn proper Draconai ways, understand their heritage and responsibilities." Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching Blaze chase Ice around the cargo bay while Midnight supervised from a perch. They were playing being kids, something they hadn't been able to do during those early desperate weeks. "It's tempting," Jake admitted. "Safe. Comfortable. Everything provided for us. But..." Rachel could hear the hesitation in his voice. Jake looked at his ship, then at the three dragons who'd refused to leave his side through everything. "They need to see the galaxy, not just one species or one culture. They're going to be important someday, right? Leaders maybe? Then they should understand more than just Draconai society. They should know about the thousands of other species out there, the different ways beings live and think." He turned to face Rachel. "Besides, we've got salvage runs to finish. That's who I am. I'm not a politician or a royal guardian in some palace. I'm a guy who flies around fixing things and finding lost stuff. Maybe that's exactly what these kids need right now. A normal life before they have to be whatever destiny has planned for them." Rachel's expression was unreadable for a moment, then she nodded slowly. "You continue to surprise me, Jake Miller. Most beings would take the power and prestige being offered. But you choose freedom and normalcy instead. Is that wrong?" Jake asked. "No. It's very human of you. And perhaps very wise." Rachel stepped closer. "Know this before you go. You've done something no one thought possible. The other species in this galaxy, they see humanity as weak sometimes. Small, fragile, short-lived. They wonder what humans bring to the greater community. What do we bring?" Jake was genuinely curious. "You care. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when it's dangerous. Even when it would be smarter and safer to walk away." Rachel's eyes held a respect Jake had never expected to see from a Draconai warrior. "You found three hatchlings you could have sold for a fortune or abandoned to avoid trouble. Instead, you risked everything to save them, protect them, raise them. You didn't do it for profit or politics or glory. You did it because it was right." She paused, letting her words sink in. "That's a strength empires can't build with all their weapons and ships. That's a strength that changes the galaxy in ways warfare never could. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. He wasn't used to this kind of recognition. He'd just done what felt right, made the choices he could live with. Word spread fast once the lone wanderer departed. Trade routes buzzed with gossip. Diplomatic channels lit up with official reports. A human and 3 royal Draconi, bonded not through conquest or contract, but through simple compassion. It was the kind of story that caught fire, spreading from station to station, planet to planet. Some species saw it as weakness, proof that humans were too emotional to be taken seriously. But others saw something different. They saw a being who'd crossed species boundaries to protect the helpless. They saw a new kind of strength, one based on caring rather than domination. Jake sat in his pilot's chair, checking the navigation systems for their next destination. There was a salvage opportunity in the Theta sector, an old freighter that had been reported as stripped clean but Jake suspected still had valuable components. Blaze was curled at his feet, his body radiating warmth that kept Jake's legs comfortable. Ice had draped herself across his lap, her head resting on the control panel, her eyes half closed in contentment. And Midnight had claimed the co-pilot's seat as his personal perch, watching the stars streak past with intense focus. "All right, crew," Jake said with a smile, reaching out to scratch behind Ice's ear ridges. "Let's go find some trouble." The 3 dragons chirped in agreement, their voices harmonizing in a way that made Jake's heart swell. As the lone wanderer jumped to hyperspace, escorted by 3 dragon-shaped shadows visible in the engine glow, the galaxy began to understand something important. Humanity's greatest weapon had never been their technology or their tactics or their determination, though they had all those things. It was their heart. Their capacity to care for others, even others completely different from themselves. Their willingness to sacrifice for those who couldn't protect themselves. And sometimes, that kind of strength changed everything.